I sacrificed my entire career to build a $50 million empire and handed the keys to my wife. I spent 12 years coding in a freezing garage so she could wear designer suits and call herself a visionary CEO. But while she was on stage accepting the Businesswoman of the Decade award, she thanked her mother, her arrogant brother, and her investors. She left out the man who actually built the product from absolute scratch. When I confronted her in the hallway, she looked at me like I was the hired help and told me I just sat at a computer while she built the brand. Her family thought I was a useless husband they could simply discard after they had extracted all my value. They had no idea that when I finally walked out the door quietly, I took the patents, the core source code, and the entire company's survival right along with me. My name is Thomas Whitaker. And this is the story of how my wife's toxic family threw me away, only to realize I was the one holding their oxygen tank. The air inside the Oak Ridge Country Club tasted like expensive champagne and unearned arrogance. It was a Tuesday night in Connecticut, and the grand ballroom was packed wall to wall with venture capitalists, tech executives, and old money families. I stood in the shadows near the swinging kitchen doors wearing a $400 suit I bought off the rack 5 years ago. I kept my head down, staying out of the way of the waiters carrying silver trays of caviar and roasted duck. I was 52 years old, standing in the back of the room at a celebration paid for by the company I built with my own 2 hands. Sentinel Logistics, a $50 million tech shipping firm that had disrupted the entire supply chain industry. And on the stage, bathed in a warm golden spotlight, stood my wife of 18 years, Sarah. She wore a custom designer gown that cost more than my first car. Her smile was practiced and flawless, radiating the kind of supreme confidence that only comes when you start believing your own lies. 12 years ago, Sarah was a mid-level sales manager drowning in credit card debt. She was frustrated, overworked, and desperate for a way out of the corporate grind. I was a senior systems architect at a major software firm. I was making incredible money, highly respected in my field, and on track to become a partner. But Sarah had a dream. She wanted to run her own logistics company. She had the charisma, the connections, and the aggressive drive to sell. What she did not have was a product. She had no software to back up her grand promises to potential clients. So I gave her one. I quit my high-paying career. I cashed out my retirement accounts and my life savings to keep our mortgage afloat. For 3 long years, I lived in our uninsulated garage writing tens of thousands of lines of complex code. I worked until my fingers cramped and my vision blurred. I missed holidays. I lost touch with my friends. I built a proprietary routing algorithm from the ground up. It was a revolutionary piece of software that could optimize freight delivery routes faster and cheaper than any competitor on the market. When it was finally finished, I handed that algorithm to Sarah. I told her to take the CEO title. I told her she was the face of the brand, the visionary, the leader. I wanted her to shine. I loved her, and I believed marriage meant elevating your partner. I stepped willingly into the background, content to be the quiet architect maintaining the servers while she stood on magazine covers. Now she was standing at a podium holding a crystal trophy, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. The crowd was dead silent, hanging on her every word. I leaned against the patterned wallpaper, a small, proud smile on my face. I was waiting for the moment we had talked about in the car on the way here. The moment she would acknowledge the partnership, the sacrifice, the 12 years of grinding behind the scenes. Building Sentinel Logistics was not a solitary journey, Sarah said into the microphone, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. It took a village. It took unwavering support from the people who truly believed in my vision when this company was nothing but an idea drawn on a napkin. She looked down at the front VIP table. To my mother, Barbara, you taught me what it means to be a strong, independent woman. You were my rock when the late nights felt endless. You told me to never give up. The crowd erupted into applause. Barbara, sitting at a table covered in expensive floral arrangements and wearing diamonds paid for by my software, stood up and waved to the room. I swallowed hard, but I kept my smile in place. Barbara had never supported the business. From the day I started coding in the garage, Barbara had told Sarah I was a fool for quitting my job. She had constantly asked Sarah when she was going to divorce me and find a real man who worked in finance or corporate law. She had called my project a pathetic hobby. Yet here she was, soaking up the applause like she had built the company herself. "And to my brother Bradley," Sarah continued, her voice rising over the cheers. "You stepped in as Vice President of Operations when I needed you most. Your strategic mind and your relentless energy helped scale this company to where it is today. You are a natural leader. I share this award with you tonight." Bradley stood up, buttoning his tailored tuxedo jacket and flashing a $1 million smile at the investors. My chest tightened. Bradley was a college dropout who had bounced from one failed startup to another, leaving a trail of debt behind him. Sarah had given him a job 3 years ago entirely out of pity because Barbara had begged her to help him. His only contribution to Sentinel Logistics was organizing lavish corporate retreats and taking credit for the system updates I deployed. I did not even know how the software functioned, yet he was taking a bow in front of the entire industry. I waited. I watched Sarah scan the room. She looked past the VIP tables. Her eyes swept right past the shadows by the kitchen doors where I was standing. "To our incredible investors, our brilliant board of directors, and our amazing sales team, thank you," she said, raising the heavy crystal trophy high above her head. "Here is to the next decade of Sentinel Logistics changing the world." The grand ballroom erupted into a massive standing ovation. The orchestra began playing a triumphant chord. Waiters rushed out with more champagne. My hands slowly dropped to my sides. My smile faded into nothing. That was it. The speech was over. She had named her mother. She had named her arrogant brother. She had named the board and the sales team. She had not said a single word about her husband. She had not mentioned the man who wrote the very code that made the company exist. It was as if I did not matter. It was as if I had been entirely erased from my own life's work. A waiter bumped hard into my shoulder, muttering a quick apology as he pushed through the kitchen doors with a tray of empty glasses. I barely felt the impact. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. This was not just a simple oversight. Sarah was a meticulous speaker. She rehearsed her speeches for weeks. This omission was a deliberate erasure. For the last 2 years, Sarah had been pushing me further and further out of the company's daily operations. She had moved my office to the windowless basement of our new corporate headquarters. She stopped inviting me to board meetings, claiming they were just boring financial reviews and that I should focus on the technical maintenance. I had ignored the red flags because I trusted my wife. I believed we were building our future together. I pushed away from the wall and walked out of the loud ballroom. The outer hallway of the country club was quiet, lined with thick plush carpets and expensive oil paintings. I paced near the coat check, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I tried to convince myself she just got caught up in the heat of the moment. I tried to tell myself she was nervous and just forgot. But the cold logic of my mind, the same analytical logic that allowed me to build complex routing algorithms, told me the painful truth. You do not forget the person who built your foundation unless you are actively trying to bury them under it. 10 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom opened. Sarah walked out into the hallway, flanked by a small group of admirers and junior executives. She was laughing brightly, holding her trophy against her chest, glowing with absolute triumph. When she saw me standing in the hallway, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The warmth vanished from her eyes. She whispered something to her group, politely excused herself, and walked over to me. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. Her tone instantly shifted from the charming CEO to an annoyed, impatient manager. "People are asking where you are. You look like you are sulking." "Are they asking about me?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Because you certainly did not seem to know I existed when you were standing on that stage." Sarah rolled her eyes and let out a loud, heavy sigh. "Oh, please do not do this right now, Tom. Do not ruin my night with your petty insecurities. This is a massive milestone for the company." "My insecurities?" I stared at her, desperately trying to find the woman I married all those years ago. She was entirely gone. She had been replaced by this corporate stranger in a designer dress. "I quit my career for you, Sarah. I lived in a freezing garage for 3 years writing the algorithm that runs every single delivery route your company makes. You just thanked Bradley for scaling the business. Bradley does not even know how to reset his own email password. Bradley handles the people, Tom, she said, her voice turning defensive and cold. He handles the vital client relationships. He handles the corporate culture. You just sit in the server room. He is a parasite, I said, stepping closer. And your mother told you I was going to ruin your life when I started coding the project. She told you to leave me. Yet they get the credit. They get the praise in front of the entire industry. What do I get, Sarah? She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with genuine irritation. The mask of the loving partner dropped completely, revealing the entitlement beneath. You want to thank you, fine. Thank you, Tom, for sitting in a dark room typing on a keyboard for a few years. Is that what you want to hear? Because while you were hiding behind a computer screen in comfortable clothes, I was out there hustling. I was pitching ruthless investors. I was building the brand from nothing. Sentinel Logistics is my company. I made it what it is today. You would not have a company without my software, I stated. The reality of her delusion was hitting me like a physical blow. She actually believed her own marketing material. Software is just a tool, she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. Anyone can hire a coder. You can outsource coding for pennies. But it takes a true visionary to build a logistics empire. You need to stop acting like you are the co-founder. You are not. You are just the IT guy who happens to be married to the CEO. Before I could even process the magnitude of that insult, the ballroom doors swung open again. Bradley walked out into the hallway holding a glass of expensive scotch. He was laughing loudly at a joke someone had told inside. He spotted us and strutted over the smugness practically radiating off his tailored suit. There is the man of the hour, Bradley mocked loudly, coming to a stop right next to Sarah. He deliberately bumped his shoulder hard against mine. I did not move an inch. Great party, right, Tommy? You should probably head back inside and make sure the club's Wi-Fi is working for the guests. We would not want the network to go down while the adults are doing real business. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud braying sound that echoed down the quiet hallway. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to defend me, waiting for her to act like a wife and tell her brother to back off. Instead, she just sighed in annoyance and adjusted her diamond earrings. Just go home, Tom, she said, not even looking at me anymore. Her gaze was already drifting back toward the ballroom doors. You are clearly in a bitter mood, and I have important investors to entertain tonight. I will take a private car back to the house later. Go home, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, go home. You are embarrassing yourself. You are. Bradley took a sip of his scotch and smirked at me over the rim of the glass. Yeah, Tommy. Let the real executives handle the heavy lifting tonight. We will let you know if we need a printer fixed on Monday. I stood there in the hallway for a long moment in total silence. I looked at Bradley, a man who contributed absolutely nothing to the world but arrogance, now proudly wearing the title of vice president. I looked at Sarah, a woman who had taken my absolute devotion, my brilliance, and my life savings, and twisted them into her own personal pedestal. They looked back at me with absolute contempt. They saw a quiet, compliant man who would just take the insult, bow his head in defeat, and walk away into the night. But they forgot one very crucial detail. I was the systems architect. I understood the structural integrity of everything I built. I knew where every single load-bearing wall was placed in Sentinel Logistics, and far more importantly, I knew exactly how to bring the entire building crashing down to the ground with a single keystroke. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum or demand respect. I simply reached down and adjusted the cuffs of my cheap suit. You are right, I said. My voice was perfectly calm. The burning anger inside my chest had suddenly vanished, leaving nothing behind but absolute freezing ice. I am just a guy who sits at a computer. Enjoy your award, Sarah. I turned my back on them and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the exit. I could hear Bradley snickering behind me. I could hear Sarah telling him to ignore my dramatic exit and get back to the investors. They truly thought they had won. They thought they had successfully put the useless husband back in his place. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club and stepped out into the freezing Connecticut night, I pulled my car keys from my pocket. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel humiliated or betrayed. I felt a dangerous, quiet clarity. Sarah thought she owned Sentinel Logistics just because her name was printed on the building and the letterhead. She had never bothered to read the fine print of the licensing agreements I had quietly drafted and filed a decade ago. She had built a $50 million empire, but she built it entirely on my land, and it was time to evict her. The drive back to Westport took exactly 42 minutes. I know this because I counted every single agonizing second. The rain had started to fall halfway down the interstate. Thick, heavy drops that smacked against the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan like thrown stones. The heater in the car was broken, blowing a lukewarm breeze that did absolutely nothing to chase away the freezing dampness settling into my bones. The rhythmic squeak of the worn windshield wipers sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the final moments of a life I no longer recognized. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute ice filling my chest. Every mile marker that passed was a reminder of the life I thought I was building. When I quit my job all those years ago, I did not just give up a paycheck. I gave up my identity. I traded my own future for a shared dream, believing that marriage meant standing shoulder to shoulder against the world. I had spent a decade treating Sarah's ambitions as if they were my own. I had poured my brilliance, my sweat, and my youth into a glowing screen in a drafty garage so she could stand in the spotlight. Now the grand illusion was shattered. The woman standing on that stage tonight was not the woman I married. She was a corporate stranger who had absorbed my life's work and discarded me the moment my usefulness ran out. I pulled into the winding driveway of our $2.5 million colonial home. The house sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured land surrounded by towering oak trees that looked like dark sentinels guarding a fortress in the night. Every brick, every window, every blade of grass had been paid for by the routing algorithm I coded in that freezing garage. I had wired the security system myself to keep my family safe. I had painted the heavy wooden shutters by hand. I had built the custom mahogany deck in the back where we used to sit and talk about our future under the stars. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, a testament to everything we had achieved together. Tonight, the massive front windows blazed with light, casting long yellow shadows across the wet black pavement. There were 2 extra cars parked near the front door. One was a silver Mercedes convertible. The other was a massive luxury SUV. I recognized them instantly. Barbara and Bradley. The parasites had not stayed at the country club to enjoy the rest of the celebration. They had rushed back here to lay a trap. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a long moment. The rain drummed a steady, relentless rhythm on the metal roof of my car. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs, and grabbed my house keys. When I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand foyer, the familiar warmth of the house wrapped around me, but it offered no comfort. The atmosphere inside was thick, heavy, and suffocating. I took off my wet coat and hung it on the brass hook by the door. The house was unnervingly quiet. I walked past the grand curved staircase and stepped into the main living room. They were waiting for me. Sarah was standing by the marble fireplace, still wearing her custom designer gown, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked exhausted, but not regretful. Her jaw was set in that familiar stubborn line she always used when she was about to demand her own way. Sitting on the expensive leather sofa was her mother, Barbara. Barbara held a crystal glass of my best scotch, her legs crossed, a look of supreme satisfaction plastered across her heavily wrinkled face, and leaning against the wide archway leading to the kitchen was Bradley. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and rolled up his sleeves, trying to look physically imposing. He held a smirk that made my hands curl into fists. Sitting directly in the center of the Persian rug was a single dark green canvas duffel bag. It was completely zipped up, bulging awkwardly at the sides. I stopped at the edge of the room. I did not yell. I did not ask what was going on. I just looked at the 3 of them, letting the silence stretch out until the tension in the room became almost unbearable. I looked at the dark green bag, then slowly shifted my gaze back to my wife. "What is this, Sarah?" I asked. My voice was perfectly calm, devoid of any anger or panic. That seemed to unsettle her. She uncrossed her arms and shifted her weight, refusing to meet my eyes directly. Before Sarah could speak, Barbara took a slow, deliberate sip of her scotch. She set the crystal glass down on the mahogany coffee table with a loud, sharp clink. She stood up, smoothing the front of her expensive dress, and walked toward me. She stopped just a few feet away, looking me up and down with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "You are a useless son-in-law," Barbara said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet room like a jagged blade. "She never needed you. You have been living off my daughter's hard work for a decade. You brought nothing to this marriage but a mediocre intellect and a pathetic lack of ambition. And frankly, we are all tired of pretending otherwise. You drag down the energy of this entire family. You are a ghost haunting a house that Sarah bought with her own blood, sweat, and tears." I kept my eyes locked on Sarah. "Is that what you think I asked her? Is that the story you are going with to justify this?" Sarah finally looked at me. Her expression was entirely blank. The woman who used to stay up late with me, sharing cheap takeout while we dreamed of building a tech company, was completely gone. "You ruined my night, Tom," Sarah said, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. "You embarrassed me in front of the most important investors in the industry. You acted like a petulant child because I did not stroke your ego on stage. I am the CEO of Sentinel Logistics. I built the brand. I secured the funding. I managed the ruthless clients. You just sat at a computer and typed. Anyone can type." "Anyone can type," I repeated slowly. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was breathtaking. She actually believed her own marketing brochures. She had completely rewritten history in her own mind to justify her betrayal. "Exactly," Bradley chimed in from the doorway. He pushed himself off the wall and took a few aggressive steps into the room. "You are just an IT guy, Tommy. You were lucky my sister let you ride her coattails for this long. But the free ride is officially over. Sentinel is moving into the big leagues now. We are negotiating a massive corporate buyout. We do not have room for a bitter, unmotivated dead weight dragging down the company image." I said, turning my gaze to Bradley. "You have been with the company for 3 years, Bradley. You spend your days playing golf and expensing lavish lunches to the corporate account. You do not even know what our core routing protocol is called." "I know how to close a deal," Bradley sneered, his face flushing red with sudden defensive anger. "I know how to manage people. I know how to navigate the complex corporate culture that Sentinel requires. Something you clearly cannot do since you have 0 friends, 0 charisma, and spend your entire life hiding in a windowless basement like a troll. You are lucky I do not charge you for the public relations work I do just to hide your embarrassing existence from our elite clients." I looked back at Barbara. She was smiling brightly. She had wanted this from the very beginning. She had never forgiven me for not coming from old money. She had never respected my quiet nature. To her, a man was only measured by how loud he could shout and how much wealth he could flash at a country club. "I want you out of this house, Tom," Sarah said. She pointed a manicured finger at the green duffel bag resting on the rug. "I packed enough clothes to last you a few days. Your toothbrush and some basic toiletries are in there. I suggest you find a cheap motel for the night. My lawyers will contact you in the morning to discuss the strict separation terms." I stared at the duffel bag. 18 years of marriage. 12 years of absolute sacrifice. A $50 million empire built entirely on my proprietary code. And my compensation was a single canvas bag of wrinkled clothes and an eviction notice from a house I paid for. The injustice of it was so massive, so profound, that it actually pushed past the point of anger and settled into a strange absolute clarity. "You are kicking me out of my own home," I said, stating a simple, undeniable fact. "It is my home," Sarah snapped quickly, her voice raising in pitch. "The deed is in the name of the holding trust, which is fully controlled by Sentinel Logistics, which means I control it. You have 0 legal rights to this property. My lawyers made sure of that this afternoon." She had planned this. This was not a spontaneous argument born out of the gala. While I was putting on my cheap suit to attend her anniversary celebration, she was finalizing the legal paperwork to throw me onto the harsh street. She had orchestrated this entire ambush with her mother and her brother. They had waited for the perfect moment to blindside me, stripping me of my home, my family, and my dignity in one calculated strike. "Where is Buster?" I asked. Buster was our golden retriever. I had rescued him 7 years ago from a local animal shelter. He was the only living creature in this massive house that actually showed me unconditional loyalty. He usually greeted me at the door with a wagging tail, but tonight he was nowhere to be seen. "I is locked in the guest bedroom upstairs," Barbara said dismissively, waving her hand in the air. We did not want him getting upset and shedding all over the expensive furniture during this conversation. "You can leave him here. Sarah will hire a professional dog walker." "I am taking my dog," I said. I took a step toward the grand staircase. Bradley moved instantly. He rushed across the living room and positioned his large frame at the bottom of the stairs, physically blocking the first step. He crossed his thick arms, jutting his chin out in a terrible imitation of a tough guy. "You are not going upstairs," Tommy Bradley said, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "You are not taking the dog. You are not taking anything except that cheap bag on the floor. If you try to push past me, I will call the police and tell them you became violent and assaulted me. Do you really want to spend the night in a concrete jail cell?" I stopped. I looked at Bradley's smug, punchable face. I could easily take him down. He was soft, out of shape, and fueled by nothing but unearned arrogance and alcohol. But I knew exactly how that would play out. Sarah would testify against me. Barbara would play the terrified, fragile victim. The police would arrest the disgruntled, aggressive husband. It would give Sarah's high-powered lawyers exactly what they needed to destroy me in family court. They wanted me to lose my temper. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw a punch. They wanted to see me break so they could feel completely justified in throwing me away like garbage. I refused to give them the satisfaction. "I also need my personal desktop computer," I said, my voice remaining unnervingly level. "The tower in my home office. It has my personal files on it." "Absolutely not," Sarah interjected immediately. She walked over and stood right next to her brother. "That computer is company property. It contains proprietary Sentinel logistics data. You are locked out of all company systems as of an hour ago. You do not touch that computer. You do not touch anything else in this house." I looked at her. Really looked at her. I searched her cold eyes for any trace of the woman I used to love. There was nothing. Just cold, hard corporate ambition and a deep-seated toxic entitlement. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully extracted every ounce of value from my brain and could now discard the empty shell. She thought I was just a naive programmer who had foolishly handed over the keys to the kingdom. She had no idea that I never actually gave her the keys. I had always handled the legal filings for the software because Sarah found that part boring and tedious. I had quietly copyrighted the core routing algorithm under my own private holding company before we were even married. The software did not belong to Sentinel Logistics. Sentinel merely had a license to use it, a license I could revoke at any time. The personal desktop she was so desperate to protect did not contain the master keys. The master keys were sitting in a highly secure safety deposit box at a regional bank downtown. Let them keep the house for now. Let them keep the expensive Italian furniture and the silver Mercedes parked in the driveway. Let them drink the scotch and laugh and believe they had conquered the world. They were standing on a fragile trapdoor, and they were the ones who had just eagerly handed me the rope. They did not understand that I was not just the quiet IT guy. I was the architect of their entire reality. And an architect always knows exactly where to place the explosives to bring the building down. "Fine," I said softly. The single word hung in the heavy air. Bradley's smirk faltered slightly. Barbara narrowed her eyes, clearly suspicious of my total lack of resistance. They had prepared for a massive fight. They had braced themselves for begging, pleading, and screaming. My absolute icy surrender completely confused them. I turned around and walked over to the center of the Persian rug. I leaned down and picked up the green canvas duffel bag. It was surprisingly light. 18 years of my life condensed into a few pounds of cotton and denim. I slung the strap over my shoulder and turned back to face the three of them one last time. "You are making a mistake," Tom Sarah said. For a brief second, she actually sounded uncertain. My silence was deeply unnerving her. It does not have to be ugly. Just sign the papers my lawyers send you tomorrow and we can all move on with our lives in peace. I will read whatever your lawyers send, I replied. I adjusted the strap of the bag on my shoulder. Enjoy the house, Sarah. Enjoy the company. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked straight toward the front door. I did not look back at the grand staircase. I did not look back at the expensive artwork on the walls. I grabbed my wet coat from the brass hook, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the freezing Connecticut night. The rain was falling harder now, turning the winding driveway into a slick, dark mirror. The cold wind bit through my thin suit shirt the very moment I stepped off the covered porch. I walked to my 10-year-old sedan, opened the trunk, and tossed the duffel bag inside. It landed with a soft, pathetic thud. I slammed the trunk shut, the metallic crash echoing loudly in the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. I stood there in the pouring rain for a long minute. The icy water plastered my hair to my forehead and soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I looked up at the massive glowing windows of the $2.5 million home I had built for a woman who despised me. Through the glass I could see Bradley laughing and clapping his hands together. I could see Barbara pouring herself another large glass of my expensive scotch. They were celebrating their victory. They were celebrating my destruction. I felt the total disrespect wash over me, mingling with the freezing rain. They had stripped me bare. They had taken my dignity, my home, my dog, and my life's work. They thought I was a weak, pathetic man walking into the darkness with nothing but the clothes on my back. But as I climbed into the driver's seat of my cold car and started the engine, a slow, dangerous calm settled over my racing mind. I wiped the rainwater from my eyes and put the car into drive. My hands did not shake. My heart did not race. The sadness was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. Sarah thought she was a visionary CEO. Bradley thought he was a tough executive. Barbara thought she was the matriarch of an empire. But they were all just clueless passengers on a ship I had designed, built, and launched. And tomorrow morning I was going to turn off the engine and watch them sink. I drove out of the massive iron gates, leaving the glowing house behind me, and merged onto the dark, empty highway. Let them celebrate tonight. Because tomorrow they were going to learn the hardest lesson of their privileged lives. Never betray the architect. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets by the time I reached the downtown business district. My 10-year-old sedan felt like a fragile tin can caught in a violent hurricane. The worn windshield wipers scraped back and forth, struggling to clear the heavy downpour, while the broken heater pushed a pathetic, rattling stream of lukewarm air against my shivering legs. I drove without a specific destination in mind, letting raw muscle memory guide me away from the affluent, gated suburbs and toward the commercial center of the city. I needed a place to think. I needed a warm room, a hot shower, and a heavy wooden door with a deadbolt where I could process the absolute reality of what had just happened. My wife of 18 years had just thrown me onto the street like a bag of discarded garbage. I pulled into the brightly lit portico of a mid-tier corporate hotel. It was the kind of place where traveling executives and regional managers stayed comfortable but not overly extravagant. The automatic glass doors slid open, welcoming me into a sprawling lobby that smelled of artificial vanilla and expensive floor wax. A large gas fire crackled in a stone hearth near the lounge area, casting a warm, inviting glow over the plush leather armchairs. For a brief, naive moment, the sheer normalcy of the environment made me feel like everything was going to be fine. I was Thomas Whitaker. I was a wealthy man. I had vast resources. I just needed to walk up to the counter, swipe a piece of plastic, get a room key, and figure out my legal strategy in the morning light. I walked up to the polished mahogany front desk, my wet shoes squeaking loudly on the marble floor. The night clerk, a young man in a crisp blue vest, offered a polite, highly practiced smile. He tapped away at his computer keyboard, asking for my identification and a credit card for the room deposit and incidentals. I reached into my damp wallet and pulled out my primary platinum card. It was tied to the joint account I shared with Sarah, the massive account where we kept our emergency liquid funds and corporate dividends. I handed it over without a single second thought. The clerk swiped it through the terminal. He frowned slightly, leaning closer to his monitor. The terminal beeped a sharp negative tone that cut through the quiet lobby. "I am sorry, sir, but it looks like this card was declined," he said, his voice lowering into that sympathetic, hushed tone retail workers use when they want to avoid embarrassing a customer in public. I shook my head, wiping cold rainwater from my eyelashes. "That has to be a system error. Run it again. There is more than enough capital in that account to buy this entire hotel building outright." He swiped it a second time. The exact same sharp beep echoed in the quiet space. He held the card up, his polite smile faltering into genuine concern. "I can try entering the numbers manually, sir, but the banking system is telling me the issuer has placed a hard, immediate hold on the account. Do you happen to have another form of payment tonight?" A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a different card, a secondary credit account we used exclusively for travel expenses and flight bookings. I handed it to him. He swiped it. Declined. I pulled out my personal checking debit card. Declined. Every single piece of plastic in my wallet produced the exact same flat negative tone. The clerk looked at me, his eyes now filled with a mixture of pity and cautious suspicion. I was a wet, shivering, middle-aged man standing in a nice hotel lobby at midnight with a stack of completely useless plastic. "Let me check my phone," I muttered, turning away from the desk so he could not see my face. My hands were shaking, not from the freezing rain, but from a sudden, terrifying realization of what Sarah and her family had actually done. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my primary banking application. The screen loaded, and the numbers that appeared made the breath vanish completely from my lungs. 0. Every single joint checking account, every high-yield savings account, every mutual fund portfolio we shared showed an available balance of $0.00. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes tracing the digital zeros over and over again, trying to force my brain to make sense of the impossible mathematics. A notification banner popped up at the top of my screen. It was an urgent automated email from a high-powered law firm I recognized immediately. They were the most aggressive, cutthroat divorce litigators in the entire state of Connecticut. I opened the email with a trembling thumb. The legal jargon was dense and threatening, but the core message was devastatingly clear. Sarah and her legal team had filed an emergency petition that very afternoon, right while I was getting dressed in my cheap suit for her anniversary gala. They had gone before a sympathetic judge and secured an ex parte asset freeze. An ex parte order meant they did it entirely behind my back without giving me a single chance to defend myself or present evidence. The justification they used to get the judge to sign it was sickening. The legal document claimed that I was a disgruntled, unstable former affiliate of Sentinel Logistics who posed a severe and immediate flight risk. They told a judge under oath that I had threatened to siphon corporate funds and disappear across state lines. Because my name was heavily tied to the joint accounts, the judge granted a temporary absolute freeze on all my liquid assets to protect the $50 million company. Sarah had not just kicked me out of my home. She had financially decapitated me with surgical precision. She had weaponized the justice system to ensure I could not fight back, could not hire a lawyer, and could not even afford a warm bed for the night. I stood in the hotel lobby, the warm air blowing down from the ceiling vents, suddenly feeling like a cruel mockery. I had sacrificed my entire career to build her empire. I had coded the very algorithms that generated the immense wealth she was now using to destroy my life. And she had taken it all away with a single signature on a legal pad. "Sir," the night clerk asked gently, leaning slightly over the mahogany counter. "Is everything all right? Do you have cash to cover the room?" I looked up at him. I looked at the warm, inviting fire crackling in the stone hearth. I looked at my useless credit cards scattered on the polished wood counter like dead leaves. "No," I said softly, gathering the plastic and shoving it back into my wet leather wallet. "I do not have cash. I am sorry to have wasted your time." I turned and walked back through the automatic doors, stepping out of the warm, vanilla-scented lobby and back into the freezing, relentless downpour. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me with a quiet click, locking me out of the world of comfort and security I had personally paid for with 12 years of my life. I walked slowly to my car, my wet shoes squeaking on the slick pavement. I pulled the heavy metal door open and collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming it shut against the storm. I did not scream. I did not hit the steering wheel in a fit of rage. I just sat there in the absolute dark, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof. The reality of my situation was settling over me like a suffocating heavy blanket. I was 52 years old. I was the secret mastermind behind a logistics company valued at $50 million. I was a man who understood complex data structures and global supply chain networks better than anyone in the industry, and I was completely, utterly homeless. I started the engine, ignoring the loud, protesting rattle of the timing belt. I checked the glowing fuel gauge on the dashboard. I had slightly less than a quarter of a tank remaining. I could not afford to drive aimlessly through the city. I needed a place to park where the local police would not tap on my window with a flashlight and tell me to move along. I drove down the empty, rain-slicked avenues until I saw the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour diner sitting on the desolate edge of the industrial district. The parking lot was vast, cracked, and mostly empty, save for a few long-haul delivery trucks idling near the back fence. I steered my sedan toward the furthest, darkest corner of the lot, parking under a flickering orange streetlight that cast long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt. I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The broken heater stopped blowing its weak air, and the freezing night temperatures immediately began to seep through the thin glass of the car windows. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out my wallet one more time. I bypassed the leather slots holding the useless frozen credit cards and opened the cash pocket. I pulled out a $20 bill, 2 tens, and 3 highly wrinkled single-dollar bills. $43. That was my entire net worth in the world. That was what 12 years of absolute loyalty, quiet sacrifice, and brilliant software engineering had been officially reduced to. $43 and a canvas duffel bag sitting in the trunk of a car that barely ran. I folded the paper bills carefully and slid them back into my wallet. There was no time for self-pity. I had to physically survive the night. I reached into the back seat and grabbed the only dry thing left in the entire vehicle, a cheap, thin fleece blanket I kept in the trunk for roadside emergencies. I pulled a lever and reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would physically go. The mechanical gears ground loudly in protest before locking into a steep, highly uncomfortable angle. I lay back against the worn upholstery, pulling the thin fleece all the way up to my chin. It was entirely inadequate against the biting cold that was rapidly overtaking the small cabin. I am not a young man anymore. At 52, my body does not forgive hard surfaces and freezing temperatures the way it used to. Within 20 minutes, the cold began to ache deep inside my joints. The worn metal springs of the driver's seat dug sharply into my lower back, sending bright flares of pain up my spine every single time I tried to shift my weight. My wet dress shirt and cheap suit trousers clung to my skin, drawing the vital heat out of my body much faster than I could generate it. I lay there in the freezing dark, staring up at the heavy water droplets streaking across the windshield under the eerie orange glow of the street lamp. I did not indulge in long, sweeping internal monologues about the grand cruelty of fate. I did not ask the universe why this massive injustice was happening to me. My mind is highly analytical. It instinctively breaks massive problems down into small, manageable components. The problem was not the universe. The problem was Sarah. The problem was Barbara. The problem was Bradley. They had deliberately ambushed me. They had used the legal system as a blunt weapon, assuming I was nothing more than a docile, compliant programmer who would simply roll over and accept total defeat. They wanted me out here in the cold. They wanted me to feel exactly what I was feeling right now, helpless, broken, freezing, and desperate. They believed that by taking away my bank accounts and my home, they had successfully taken away my power. They genuinely thought the massive wealth of Sentinel Logistics belonged entirely to them simply because they held the fancy corporate titles and occupied the glass corner offices. A violent shiver wrecked through my frame, rattling my teeth together audibly. I pulled my knees up slightly, trying desperately to conserve body heat, wrapping my arms tightly around my chest beneath the thin fleece blanket. The physical discomfort was intense, pushing right against the edge of unbearable. The cold seemed to bite directly into my bones, a raw, undeniable reminder of my current physical vulnerability. Every single time I exhaled, a small, thick cloud of white vapor formed in the freezing air of the cabin, hovering just above my face. But beneath the violent shivering, beneath the sharp stabbing pain radiating from my lower back, a profound and highly dangerous clarity began to take root in my mind. They had made a catastrophic foundational miscalculation. They had focused so entirely on the money, the legal paperwork, and the physical property that they completely forgot about the architecture of the system itself. They had legally frozen the bank accounts, but they had not frozen my intellect. They had locked me out of the corporate network, but they did not understand that the network only existed because I continuously allowed it to exist. I thought about Bradley standing aggressively at the bottom of my grand staircase, puffing out his soft chest and threatening to call the police on me. I thought about Barbara sitting on my Persian rug, sipping my expensive scotch and calling me a useless parasite. I thought about Sarah standing in her custom designer gown, looking down her nose and telling me I was just an IT guy who typed on a keyboard. They had discarded me with extreme prejudice because they thought my overall usefulness had run its course. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently operating a massive, highly complex digital machine, and they had just eagerly thrown away the only person on Earth who knew how to stop the engine from exploding. I shifted my hips again, trying in vain to find a position that did not put agonizing pressure on my spine. It was completely useless. The old car seat was an absolute torture device. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind to endure the physical reality of the freezing night. The extreme cold was a teacher. The sharp pain was a permanent reminder. I let the absolute freezing misery of the situation burn away any lingering traces of sentimentality I might have still held for my wife, the quiet, supportive man who had loved her. The man who had willingly stepped into the shadows so she could shine in the spotlight died permanently in this frozen parking lot. The rain continued to hammer against the metal roof, a relentless driving drumming that perfectly matched the steady calculating rhythm of my own racing heart. I did not need to hack into their secured systems. I did not need to break a single federal law. I just needed to survive the night, wake up tomorrow morning, walk into a regional bank, and retrieve the single piece of paper that proved Sentinel Logistics did not actually own the software they were currently trying to sell to billionaires. I pulled the thin, inadequate blanket higher over my shivering shoulders, staring into the dark. Let them sleep peacefully in their warm, expensive beds tonight. Let them drink champagne and celebrate their clever, ruthless legal maneuvers. They had taken my house, my dog, and my life savings, but tomorrow morning I was going to take their entire world. I closed my eyes, ignored the freezing air, and waited for the sun to rise. The sun did not rise so much as the freezing rain simply turned from black to a miserable slate gray, washing over the city like a dirty rag. I woke up shivering violently in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan. Every single muscle in my lower back screamed in sharp, blinding protest as I tried to sit up straight. The thin, cheap fleece blanket I had pulled over my shoulders during the long night had done absolutely nothing to stop the brutal Connecticut cold from sinking directly into my bones. My breath plumed in the freezing cabin air, thick and white, hanging in front of my face like smoke. I rubbed my frozen hands over my face, feeling the rough stubble on my jaw and the deep, exhausted bags under my eyes. Just 24 hours ago, I was putting on a tailored shirt to attend a gala celebrating a $50 million company. I had stood in a grand ballroom that smelled of expensive champagne and roasted duck. Now I was a homeless man trying to massage the agonizing cramps out of his legs in the desolate, cracked parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I gathered my $43 from my wallet, pushed open the heavy, groaning car door, and walked across the wet asphalt toward the glowing neon sign. The bell above the diner door jingled cheerfully, a sharp, almost mocking contrast to the absolute devastation I was carrying inside my chest. The place smelled strongly of old bacon grease, burnt toast, and industrial bleach. It was mostly empty save for a tired truck driver asleep in a corner booth and a waitress with tired eyes wiping down the long Formica counter. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth near the front window, ignoring the sticky feeling on the table surface. I ordered a black coffee. I did not have the appetite or the budget for anything else. When the waitress set the thick porcelain mug in front of me, I wrapped both my frozen hands around it, desperate to absorb whatever heat I could into my numb fingers. I sat there watching the morning traffic slowly pick up on the wet highway outside. I needed a concrete plan. My bank accounts were entirely frozen. My house was stolen. My wife had transformed into a ruthless corporate monster who had discarded me without a single ounce of hesitation. I needed to figure out how to get to the regional bank downtown to access my safety deposit box before her legal team found a way to block that too. Before I could even take a third sip of the bitter scalding coffee, the cheerful bell above the diner door jingled again. A man walked in. I was wearing a damp gray windbreaker and a faded blue baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He did not look up at the illuminated menu above the counter. He did not look at the waitress holding the coffee pot. His eyes scanned the small, poorly lit room and immediately locked onto me. He carried a thick, heavy manila envelope in his right hand. My analytical mind. The same mind that had built complex routing algorithms from absolute scratch instantly recognized the threat walking toward me. This man was not here for a warm breakfast. He walked straight toward my booth, his wet boots squeaking loudly against the checkered linoleum floor, leaving muddy footprints behind him. "Are you Thomas Whitaker?" the man asked. His voice was flat, entirely devoid of any emotion or empathy. He was just a man doing a job completely unaware that he was participating in the brutal execution of my life. I did not answer right away. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the heat travel down my dry throat, and then I simply nodded my head. "Yes, I am Thomas Whitaker." The man did not say another word. He did not apologize. He just dropped the thick manila envelope onto the sticky table right next to my coffee mug. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the quiet diner. "You have been served," he said. He turned around immediately and walked out the door, disappearing into the gray morning rain as quickly as he had arrived, leaving me completely alone with the weapon my wife had sent to destroy me. I stared at the thick envelope. The return address, printed in bold black ink, belonged to the most aggressive, ruthless family law firm in the entire state of Connecticut. Sarah had not wasted a single second. While I was freezing in my car, fighting just to keep my teeth from chattering in the dark, she had been comfortably sleeping in our $2.5 million home, knowing this legal bomb was about to be dropped directly onto my lap. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the metal clasp back. I slid the thick stack of legal documents out onto the table. The paper was crisp, heavy, and expensive. I began to read the petition for dissolution of marriage, and with every single line my eyes scanned, the sheer audacity of my wife's betrayal became more astonishing. The narrative they had constructed within these legal pages was a masterpiece of corporate fiction and absolute character assassination. According to Sarah and her high-priced lawyers, I was not the brilliant systems architect who had sacrificed his high-paying career to build Sentinel Logistics from the ground up. I was not the co-founder. I was not even a silent partner. The legal document explicitly referred to me as an unpaid hobbyist. They claimed that I had simply tinkered with some basic coding in the garage to pass the time, while Sarah, the visionary CEO, had done all the actual heavy lifting to build the brand, secure the clients, and generate the massive wealth. They were legally erasing 12 years of my blood, sweat, and absolute devotion. They were attempting to rewrite history, painting me as a lazy, unmotivated spouse who had happily coasted on his wife's coattails for a decade while she carried the entire weight of the world on her shoulders. But the absolute worst part was the list of demands. The petition demanded that I immediately relinquish any and all claims to Sentinel Logistics. It demanded that I sign away all rights to the intellectual property, the source code, the corporate real estate, and the financial assets. They demanded that I hand over the keys to the entire $50 million empire without a single fight, and in exchange for my total surrender, for walking away quietly and never bothering the great CEO ever again. Sarah was generously offering me a spousal support stipend of exactly $2,000 a month. $2,000. The company I built generated that amount of profit every 4 minutes. Sarah spent more than $2,000 on a single pair of designer shoes for a weekend trip. It was an insult so massive, so deeply disrespectful that it actually transcended anger. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt to break my spirit completely and force me to submit to her total authority. I read through the financial disclosures attached to the back of the massive petition. They had listed the house, the luxury cars, the investment portfolios, and the offshore accounts. They had completely drained our joint checking accounts, moving all our liquid capital into a private trust controlled entirely by Sarah and her brother Bradley. They had cornered me with terrifying precision. They had used the legal system to strip me bare, leaving me penniless and stranded in a cheap diner with exactly $43 to my name. They expected me to panic. They expected me to look at this massive stack of threatening legal paperwork, look at my empty bank accounts, and surrender out of pure, terrified desperation. They thought I would eagerly sign my name on the dotted line just to guarantee that $2,000 monthly lifeline so I would not starve on the cold streets. They were treating me like a stray dog begging for table scraps. As I sat there absorbing the profound depth of her cruelty, my smartphone vibrated violently against the table, startling me. I picked it up. The screen illuminated with a new text message notification. It was from Bradley. I opened the message, and what I saw made the blood in my veins run completely cold, freezing my heart inside my chest. It was a photograph. The image was taken outside my home, the beautiful colonial house I had personally maintained and loved for years. In the driveway sat a massive rusted commercial dumpster, and inside that dumpster was my entire life. I could see my expensive ergonomic office chair thrown violently upside down, one of the wheels completely snapped off. I could see the custom oak desk I had built with my own hands smashed into jagged pieces. I could see my technical manuals, my old framed university diplomas, and the comfortable sweaters I used to wear when I coded late into the freezing night, all soaked in dirty rainwater and covered in household trash. Bradley had not just packed up my home office. He had destroyed it with absolute malice. He had thrown 12 years of my quiet existence straight into the garbage for the entire wealthy neighborhood to see. Beneath the photograph was a short, gloating text message that dripped with unearned arrogance. Out with the old garbage, in with the new. Just moved into the big corner office at the house. Mom says my new title is officially Vice President of Operations. Hope you enjoy the diner food, Tommy. Make sure you sign those papers today, or we will have the lawyers cut off your cell phone plan tomorrow morning. Have a great life. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my eyes burning. I looked at the picture of my destroyed office, my diplomas shattered under bags of trash. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents demanding my total surrender and erasing my legacy. And then I looked out the diner window at the gray, miserable rain falling endlessly on the highway. My wife had taken my company and branded me a hobbyist. My mother-in-law had taken my dignity and called me useless, and my arrogant, financially illiterate brother-in-law had literally thrown my life into a dumpster while claiming a high-level executive title he could not even spell. They had executed a perfect, ruthless slaughter of my entire world. I was completely cornered. I had no home to return to. I had no money to hire a lawyer to fight this massive legal petition. I was utterly erased from the narrative they were selling to the world. I placed the phone face down on the table. I picked up my black coffee and took a long, slow sip. The liquid was lukewarm now, bitter and stale, leaving a harsh taste on my tongue. But I did not care. The sadness was gone. The shock was gone. A profound, terrifying calmness was washing over my highly analytical mind. Sarah thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess. She thought she had maneuvered her pieces perfectly, trapping my king in the corner of the board with overwhelming legal and financial force. She truly believed that by stealing the money, freezing the bank accounts, and controlling the real estate, she had completely won the game. But Sarah was never a master strategist. She was just a loud salesperson who desperately believed her own marketing brochures. She had forgotten the most fundamental rule of the technology empire she claimed to rule. Hardware is completely useless without the operating system. She could take the house. Bradley could take the corner office and print himself 100 shiny business cards with his fake vice president title. Barbara could drink all the expensive scotch she wanted and celebrate the permanent eviction of the useless son-in-law. They could hold all the physical assets in the world, but they did not hold the code. I looked at the legal document again. The words "unpaid hobbyist" glared back at me, mocking my years of sacrifice. I reached into my damp trouser pocket and touched the small, cold metal key resting securely inside. It was the key to my safety deposit box at the regional bank downtown. The box that held the original ironclad copyright filings for Thomas Whitaker Holdings, LLC. The box that held the master admin credentials to the entire Sentinel Logistics routing algorithm. They wanted me to sign away my rights to a company I did not even technically own. I owned the private holding company. Sentinel Logistics was just a corporate tenant, living in my digital building, operating entirely on a revocable license I had granted them out of love, and they had just violently assaulted the landlord. I neatly stacked the expensive legal documents back together, aligning the edges perfectly, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I did not feel defeated anymore. The cold fear that had gripped me in the car was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, diamond, hard resolve that nothing could break. I stood up from the vinyl booth, pulled a wrinkled $5 bill from my wallet, and placed it on the sticky table to cover the cheap coffee. I walked out of the diner and stepped back into the freezing Connecticut rain. I did not look back at the building. Let them throw my desk in the dumpster. Let them laugh in their warm, stolen mansion. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of their privileged lives. You cannot fire the architect when you are still standing inside the building he designed. It was time to go to the bank. It was time to pull the plug. The morning light offered absolutely no warmth. It was nothing more than a pale, miserable gray filter pushed over a freezing city. I drove away from the diner parking lot with the heater in my 10-year-old sedan still rattling and blowing cold air against my damp legs. My destination was not a lawyer's office or a police station. Sarah and her family had expected me to panic. They expected me to spend the morning frantically calling cheap attorneys or begging my former colleagues for a loan. They had orchestrated an ex parte asset freeze to cut off my oxygen, assuming I would suffocate in the cold and come crawling back to sign their ridiculous divorce petition. But they fundamentally misunderstood how my mind worked. When you are a systems architect, panic is your worst enemy. You do not react to a system failure by screaming at the monitor. I isolate the problem. I trace the error all the way back to the core root directory. You find the foundational code, and you rewrite the permissions. I steered my car through the morning traffic, heading away from the towering glass skyscrapers of the corporate district. I was driving toward an older, much quieter, and heavily forgotten part of the industrial city. I pulled up to a small, unassuming regional bank sitting on a quiet corner in a working-class neighborhood. It was a modest brick building with faded green awnings and a heavy wooden front door. I had not stepped foot inside this specific branch in over a decade. Sarah did not even know this bank existed. She only cared about the massive international financial institutions with marble floors and private wealth managers who served sparkling water in crystal glasses. To her, a small community bank was beneath our status. To me, it was the perfect place to hide the most valuable asset in the entire logistics industry. I parked my car along the wet curb, turned off the rattling engine, and stepped out into the freezing drizzle. My cheap suit was still deeply wrinkled from sleeping in the cramped driver's seat, and my tired joints ached intensely with every single step. But my analytical mind was crystal clear. I slowly walked up the short, cracked concrete steps and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior of the bank smelled like old paper floor wax and stale coffee. It was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the clicking of a keyboard from a lone teller behind the bulletproof glass. The lobby was entirely empty. I walked straight to the counter. The teller, an older woman with thick glasses and a kind smile, looked up from her screen. She did not see a homeless man or a defeated husband. She just saw a customer. I told her I needed to access my safety deposit box. I reached into my damp pocket, my fingers brushing past the worthless $43 in my wallet, and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. I handed her my driver license. She typed my name into her terminal, verified my signature on a small paper card, and nodded. She picked up a large ring of master keys and gestured for me to follow her. We walked down a narrow hallway lined with dark wood paneling, arriving at a thick steel vault door that looked like it belonged in a military submarine. She spun the heavy metal wheel, pulling the massive door open with a deep mechanical groan. The vault room was cold, silent, and completely isolated from the outside world. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of small metal doors. The teller led me to a box near the bottom row, number 407. She inserted her master key into the left lock, and I inserted my brass key into the right lock. We turned them at the exact same time. The metal latch clicked open with a satisfying, heavy sound. The teller respectfully stepped out of the vault, closing the heavy gate behind her, leaving me completely alone in the silent room. I pulled the long metal container out of the wall and carried it over to a small wooden viewing desk in the corner. I slowly sat down in the wooden chair, closed my eyes for a second, and took a long, deep breath to steady my racing heart. For 12 years, Sarah had built her entire identity on the illusion of absolute control. She truly believed she owned Sentinel Logistics. I reached out and lifted the metal lid of the box. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. There were no emergency funds or hidden gold coins. Instead, resting at the very top was a sealed manila folder containing original physical copyright filings. Beneath that was a black encrypted hard drive holding the server master keys to the proprietary routing algorithm. And beneath the drive was a perfectly preserved, legally binding limited liability company operating agreement. I carefully moved the legal documents aside and picked up the only personal item in the metal box. It was an old, faded photograph of my late father and me. We were standing in front of our old garage in Ohio, leaning against a rusted pickup truck. I stared at his face, remembering the exact day that picture was taken. It was a Sunday afternoon, shortly after I had quit my high-paying corporate job to start writing the code for what would eventually become Sentinel Logistics. I was sitting at a folding table in that freezing garage, staring at thousands of lines of raw code, feeling completely overwhelmed. My father had walked in holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He set one down next to my keyboard, pulled up a folding chair, and watched me work for a long time in total silence. My father was a quiet, blue-collar man who built houses for a living. He did not understand software or algorithms, but he understood the fundamental nature of building a foundation. He had pointed a rough, calloused finger at my computer screen. He told me that I was building a digital house, and he gave me a father's advice that I would never forget. He looked me dead in the eye, his face completely serious, and he said, "Never hand over the keys to the house you built, son. Even to family. Own the foundation. Because if you do not own the foundation, you are just a guest in your own home, and guests can always be evicted." I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. I had taken his words to heart that very same week. Before Sarah and I ever stood at an altar, before we ever signed a marriage certificate, before she ever ordered her first box of fancy chief executive officer business cards, I had quietly copyrighted the entire core routing code. I registered it under a private entity called Thomas Whitaker Holdings. I was the sole proprietor. I never transferred the intellectual property to Sentinel Logistics. When the company launched, I simply granted Sentinel a revocable license to use the software, a license that required my ongoing consent. Sarah and her vicious lawyers had spent all night fighting over the furniture, the cars, and the bank accounts. They had successfully locked me out of the corporate offices and thrown my desk into a dumpster. But they had failed to realize that the entire $50 million tech empire was just a digital tenant living on my private property. I carefully placed the photograph back into the metal box. I picked up the sealed operating agreement and the thick stack of original copyright filings. The crisp, heavy paper felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. The legal petition Sarah had served me at the diner that morning demanded I relinquish all my claims to Sentinel Logistics in exchange for $2,000 a month. It was a demand based entirely on a fabricated reality where she was the owner and I was just an unpaid hobbyist. But reality was not determined by who shouted the loudest at a country club gala. Reality was determined by ink paper and federal law. I placed the documents and the encrypted hard drive into my damp jacket pocket. I closed the empty metal box, slid it back into the vault wall, and locked it. I stood up from the wooden viewing desk, feeling the brutal ache in my lower back fade into nothing. I was no longer the frozen, defeated man sleeping in a diner parking lot. I was the sole architect of their entire digital reality. It was time to officially terminate their lease. I walked out of the quiet vault, pushed through the heavy wooden front doors of the bank, and stepped right back out into the freezing morning rain, fully prepared and ready to bring her stolen empire crashing down to the ground. The rain was hammering against the cracked windows of the downtown public library. It was a massive storm system, the exact kind of extreme weather front that my own software had predicted 3 days ago. I sat at a scratched wooden desk in the back corner, staring at a monitor that looked like it belonged in a museum. The keyboard was sticky, and the mouse barely tracked across the worn plastic pad. To my left, a teenager was sleeping face down on a pile of textbooks. To my right, an elderly man was reading a newspaper from last week. Nobody looked at me. Nobody knew that the guy sitting there in a damp jacket, the guy who had just been stripped of his home and his dignity by a ruthless divorce attorney, was holding the detonator to a $50 million corporate empire. Right now, exactly 12 blocks away, Sarah was sitting in a glass-walled boardroom at the top of the Sentinel Logistics Tower. I could picture the scene perfectly. She would be wearing her tailored designer suit, flashing that perfect, practiced smile. Today was the day she had been working toward for years. The final signature on the buyout. A major tech conglomerate was acquiring Sentinel Logistics for a staggering amount of money. They were not buying her trucks. They were not buying her warehouses. They were buying the proprietary routing engine that allowed Sentinel to completely dominate the supply chain market. That engine was a masterpiece. It dynamically recalculated freight paths around extreme weather, predicting storm sequences, blizzards, and road closures with flawless accuracy. It allowed Sentinel trucks to maneuver through atmospheric rivers and hurricane warnings, while their competitors were left stranded on flooded highways. It cut their fuel costs by 40% and made them industry untouchables. At every corporate gala and industry dinner, Sarah had taken the microphone and proudly accepted the credit for revolutionizing modern logistics. She had convinced the buyers, the board, and probably herself that it was all her own triumph. When she filed for divorce, she had called me dead weight. She told her lawyers I contributed nothing to her success. She wanted me erased from the narrative entirely. What the tech conglomerate did not know, and what Sarah had conveniently ignored in her blinding arrogance, was the foundational architecture of that system. I did not just write the code on a lazy weekend. I bled into it. I spent years perfecting the algorithms, building complex data models to handle extreme storm sequences and unpredictable transit variables. It was my mind that guided her fleet through the dark. And because I was cautious, or maybe because I always understood the fundamental brutality of the business world, I never handed the intellectual property over to Sentinel Logistics. I registered the core algorithm under my own independent limited liability company. I granted Sarah a commercial license to use the software, a free trial to be exact. I waived the massive enterprise fees because she was my wife. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a gift to the woman I loved to help her build her dream. The contract was ironclad, filed quietly in the background of her early startup days. Section 4, Paragraph 2 explicitly stated that the licensor reserved the right to terminate the trial immediately upon breach of terms, which included the failure to transition to a paid tier after 30 days. I had let that trial run for 3 long years. I opened a basic web browser on the library computer. The screen flickered as I typed in the uniform resource locator for the master administrative portal. It was a simple, stark black screen with a single login prompt. There were no flashy graphics. There were no corporate logos. It was just a quiet, unadorned gateway to the entire nervous system of Sentinel Logistics. I typed my administrative username. I typed my master password. The system authenticated instantly, and the dashboard populated on the screen. It was beautiful in its cold efficiency. A digital map of North America spread out before me, thousands of tiny green dots moving perfectly across the grid. Each dot was a Sentinel truck guided safely through storms and traffic by my design. I could see a cluster of vehicles smoothly diverting around a massive blizzard developing over the Midwest. The system was functioning flawlessly, carrying her company toward its massive payday. In the top right corner of the screen, the license status glowed in bright green letters. It read Active Free Trial Tier. I sat back in the hard plastic library chair and took a slow, deep breath. I did not need to hack her servers. I did not need to deploy a virus, write a malicious script, or act like a criminal. I was simply a business owner preparing to enforce a standard software licensing agreement. Sarah had tried to destroy me through the legal system. She had weaponized attorneys to strip me of my house, my savings, and my pride. She had looked me in the eye in front of a judge and declared that I was a worthless parasite who deserved nothing from her empire. It was only fitting that I used a legal contract to balance the scales. I moved the cursor to the administrative panel on the left side of the screen. My hand did not shake. My heart was not racing. I felt an absolute freezing calm wash over me. I clicked on the License Management tab. A drop-down menu appeared listing the various control options for the proprietary software. I scrolled down past the options to renew the license. I scrolled past the options to upgrade the tier. I hovered the white arrow directly over the red text that read Terminate License. I pictured the boardroom again. The executives from the tech conglomerate would have their expensive pens in hand. The champagne would be chilling in a silver bucket in the corner of the room. Sarah would be leaning forward, ready to sign away the company and walk away with millions, leaving me with the scraps of a broken life. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought she had won a game I did not even know we were playing. I pressed the left button on the mouse. A small dialog box popped up in the center of the screen. It presented a final warning. This action will immediately revoke all data access and halt algorithmic routing for the client Sentinel Logistics. Do you wish to proceed? I looked away from the monitor for a moment, watching the heavy rain lashing against the library window. I thought about the storm that was about to hit that glass boardroom. Without this routing algorithm, Sentinel Logistics was nothing. Their competitive advantage would vanish in a single second. The trucks currently relying on the system to navigate the Midwest blizzard would lose their dynamic navigation. The tech conglomerate would instantly realize that the core asset they were purchasing did not actually belong to the company they were buying. The valuation would plummet from $50 million to zero. I turned my attention back to the screen. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt the pure, undeniable weight of justice. I moved the cursor over the confirmation button and clicked. The green dots on the map instantly froze. The dynamic weather overlays vanished from the grid. The bright green text in the top right corner blinked once and changed to a solid, unforgiving red. Terminated. In a fraction of a second, the central nervous system of Sentinel Logistics went completely dark. The proprietary technology driving a $50 million acquisition was gone legally and permanently pulled back into my possession. I watched the screen for another minute, letting the silence of the library wash over me. I logged out of the master portal, closed the browser, and carefully cleared the computer's history. I stood up from the desk, pushed the chair back, and adjusted my damp jacket. The teenager to my left was still sleeping. The elderly man to my right was still reading his old newspaper. The world inside the library had not changed at all. But as I walked out through the double doors and back into the pouring rain, I knew that 12 blocks away, Sarah's perfect corporate illusion was already burning to the ground. She had built her entire kingdom on a foundation of lies, and she had handed me the power to pull the plug. I would later read the sworn legal depositions from the Silicon Valley executives, detailing exactly what happened in that corner office at 9 o'clock in the morning. They described a scene of absolute pristine corporate confidence right up until the very second the floor completely collapsed beneath them. Sarah had orchestrated the perfect environment to close a $50 million acquisition. The glass-walled boardroom at the top of the Sentinel Logistics Tower offered a commanding view of the Connecticut skyline. The massive mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. Expensive catered pastries and imported sparkling water sat untouched in the center of the room. Sarah was standing at the head of the table wearing a tailored white designer suit, projecting the flawless image of a fearless visionary leader. To her right sat her mother, Barbara, wearing a smug smile and diamond earrings paid for by my software brought in as a supposed board member to enjoy the victory lap. To her left was Bradley wearing a silk tie and leaning back in his leather chair, pretending he understood the massive stacks of financial documents resting in front of him. The trap was set, and they had absolutely no idea they were the ones standing on the trigger. On the massive 80-inch projector screen behind Sarah, my proprietary routing algorithm was running its final live demonstration. The buyers were a group of ruthless tech billionaires known for tearing apart weak companies. They were not interested in Sarah's marketing brand or her charming speeches. They were exclusively interested in the dynamic weather prediction matrix that was currently guiding 300 Sentinel delivery trucks around a developing blizzard in the Midwest. The glowing green dots moved perfectly across the digital map, rerouting freight in real time, saving thousands of dollars in fuel costs every single hour. The lead buyer, a stern man with silver hair and zero patience for incompetence, was actually nodding in quiet approval. The software was performing flawlessly because I had built it to be flawless. The acquisition contracts were sitting right there on the table. The expensive pens were uncapped. The deal was mere minutes away from being signed. Sarah was right in the middle of her rehearsed closing speech, taking full, unadulterated credit for the sheer brilliance of the network when the clock struck exactly 9 in the morning. That was the precise moment my termination command reached the central servers. The glowing green dots on the massive projector screen instantly stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the executives just stared, assuming the presentation had simply buffered or the wireless internet connection had dropped. But then the vibrant digital map of North America flickered violently and vanished entirely. It was replaced by a solid, blinding, pitch-black background. The sudden shift in light cast a harsh, dark shadow across Sarah's face. She stopped speaking mid-sentence, her polished smile freezing in place. A single string of text appeared in the exact center of the black screen, glowing in bright, unforgiving crimson letters. Enterprise license expired. Unauthorized use of intellectual property. Contact legal owner, Thomas Whitaker Holdings. The boardroom fell into a silence so deep and heavy that you could clearly hear the low hum of the air conditioning vents. The crimson words hung in the air like a death sentence. The absolute confidence Sarah had worn like a shield shattered into a million jagged pieces. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale, terrified, and entirely lost. Barbara slowly lowered her crystal glass of sparkling water, her wrinkled brow furrowing in deep confusion. Bradley, desperate to maintain his fake persona as the highly capable vice president of operations, immediately jumped out of his expensive leather chair. He let out a loud, forced, nervous laugh, waving his hand dismissively at the Silicon Valley executives. He aggressively assured them it was just a minor server glitch, a simple graphical error that his IT department would sort out in a few short seconds. He rushed over to the presentation laptop sitting on the wooden podium. Bradley did not know the first thing about software architecture. He was a man who struggled to format a basic spreadsheet. He slammed his heavy fingers against the keyboard, trying to force a hard reboot of the presentation software. When that did not work, he tried to frantically bypass the crimson warning screen using a generic administrator password he had memorized for his corporate email account. That was his fatal mistake. My system was explicitly designed to protect itself against unauthorized forced entry. When Bradley attempted to bypass the hard lock, the algorithm instantly recognized a brute force attack. It did exactly what I had programmed it to do. It triggered the ultimate security protocol. A loud, sharp alarm tone blared through the laptop speakers, echoing violently off the glass walls of the boardroom. The crimson text on the projector disappeared instantly, replaced by a chaotic, cascading waterfall of encrypted code. The system executed a localized AES 256-bit encryption lockdown on the entire local network. It was a digital guillotine. Every single computer terminal in the Sentinel Logistics headquarters locked tight. The corporate desk phones stopped routing. The massive dispatch screens down in the warehouse went completely dark. Bradley stood completely frozen at the podium, his hands shaking uncontrollably, staring at the endless stream of encrypted numbers scrolling rapidly across the massive screen. He had just essentially locked the entire company inside a digital vault and thrown the only key into the deepest part of the ocean. The sheer panic in the room spiked as Sarah's cell phone began to vibrate wildly against the mahogany table. Then Bradley's phone started ringing. Then the boardroom landline lit up. It was the warehouse managers, the regional dispatchers, and the stranded truck drivers. The entire $50 million company was literally stopping on the highways, completely blind and paralyzed. The lead buyer from the tech conglomerate did not panic. He was a veteran corporate shark who understood federal intellectual property law better than anyone else in that room. He stood up slowly from the table, his expression turning into a mask of pure, cold, unadulterated fury. He looked at the locked screen, read the words, Thomas Whitaker, holdings out loud, and then turned his piercing, ruthless gaze directly onto Sarah. He did not yell. He asked her a very simple, devastating question. He asked if she actually owned the proprietary technology they were about to spend $50 million on, or if she was trying to sell a stolen vehicle without possessing the legal title. Sarah stammered helplessly. The brilliant, visionary CEO was reduced to a stumbling, desperate mess. She tried to fall back on her practiced charm. She tried to explain that Thomas was just her estranged husband, a disgruntled, bitter former employee who was playing a petty illegal prank. She promised, with tears welling in her eyes, that she would have her aggressive legal team completely squash the issue by the afternoon. But billionaires do not spend their vast fortunes on empty promises, and they certainly do not acquire companies actively engaged in federal intellectual property theft. The lead executive did not even wait for her to finish her desperate excuse. He reached down and snapped his heavy leather briefcase shut with a loud, definitive crack that sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. He looked at Sarah with absolute disgust. I informed her that she had just committed massive corporate fraud by deliberately misrepresenting her core assets during a highly regulated federal acquisition period. He stated clearly that the buyout deal was entirely dead, permanently revoked, and that his own aggressive legal department would be contacting the authorities to report her attempted financial scam. He gestured to his team, and the buyers marched out of the glass boardroom without a single backward glance, leaving the unsigned, worthless contracts sitting unattended on the polished table. Sarah collapsed backward into her expensive chair, her trembling hands covering her face, struggling to pull air into her lungs. Barbara sat frozen in her seat, completely speechless, her diamond earrings suddenly looking very heavy. And Bradley just stood by the podium, staring blankly at the scrolling encrypted code, finally realizing that the quiet, useless husband they had eagerly thrown out into the freezing rain was the only thing keeping their entire world alive. Sentinel Logistics was officially dead. I sat in a heavy leather chair that cost more than the vehicle I had slept in just 2 nights ago. The corner office of Richard Sterling was a masterclass in quiet, expensive intimidation. It was located on the 42nd floor of a downtown skyscraper, far above the miserable gray rain that was still washing over the Connecticut streets. Richard was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless intellectual property law firms on the entire East Coast. I was not the kind of lawyer you hired to negotiate a polite, friendly settlement. He was the kind of apex predator you hired when you wanted to completely obliterate your opponent. When I had walked into his reception area that morning, cold, damp, and carrying a wrinkled manila envelope, his paralegals had looked at me with polite pity. But the exact second, Richard had reviewed the original physical copyright filings and the airtight limited liability company operating agreement. I pulled from my safety deposit box. The pity vanished entirely. He took my case on full contingency before I even finished drinking the hot coffee his assistant poured for me. Richard was currently sitting behind his massive mahogany desk reviewing the digital logs of the server crash we had just initiated from the public library. A rare, genuinely terrifying smile spread across his face. He looked up at me and adjusted his expensive silver reading glasses. "You really built a perfect trap, Thomas," he said, his voice smooth and professional. "They have absolutely no legal standing. The license was granted strictly as a free trial, contingent on your ongoing consent as the sole proprietor of Thomas Whitaker Holdings. They never paid you a single licensing fee. They never transferred the intellectual property into the corporate trust. From a legal standpoint, Sentinel Logistics is essentially a squatter living in a house you own, and you just changed the locks on the front door. Before I could respond, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass surface of the coffee table. The caller identification flashed brightly. It was Sarah. I looked at the glowing screen, watching her name pulse. 2 days ago, that name would have triggered a wave of deep anxiety and a desperate need to fix whatever problem she was facing. Now it was just a name attached to a stranger. Richard glanced at the phone, then looked at me. "Put it on speaker," he instructed calmly, crossing his arms. "Let her dig the hole a little deeper for us." I reached out, tapped the screen, and answered the call. I did not say hello. I did not offer a greeting. I just let the heavy silence stretch over the line. "Tom, turn it back on, right now." Sarah was not just yelling. She was screaming. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of the polished, confident tone she used for her investors and magazine interviews. "You turn the servers back on this exact second, or I swear to God I will have you thrown in federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. Do you have any idea what you just did? You humiliated me in front of the acquisition board. You locked the entire network. My trucks are stopping on the highways." I leaned back in the leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. "I am fully aware of what I did." "Sarah," I replied, my voice quiet and utterly devoid of emotion. "I terminated an expired software license. It was a standard administrative procedure." "Standard procedure." She let out a chaotic, breathless laugh that bordered on complete hysteria. "You hacked my company, Tom. You committed federal cyber terrorism. Bradley is already on the phone with the police right now. My lawyers are drafting a criminal complaint as we speak. You are a dead man. We are going to take everything you have. We are going to crush you until you have nothing left. You are going to rot in a concrete cell for trying to sabotage my $50 million buyout." I listened to her threats with a strange sense of complete detachment. She was still operating under the grand delusion that she held all the cards. She was still trying to bully the quiet IT guy she thought she had successfully evicted. I looked at Richard. He gave me a slow, encouraging nod, entirely unimpressed by her screaming. "You cannot take everything from me, Sarah," I said slowly, emphasizing every single word so it would cut through her panic. "Because you already did. You froze my bank accounts. You threw my desk into a dumpster. You handed me a bag of wrinkled clothes and kicked me out into the freezing rain. You served me with divorce papers claiming I was an unpaid hobbyist. You told a judge I was a flight risk to steal the money I helped you earn. You left me with exactly $43 to my name. You already did your absolute worst. There is nothing left for you to take." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. The sound of her frantic breathing echoed through the phone's speaker. "Turn the software back on, Tom," she demanded again, though the absolute conviction in her voice was beginning to crack at the edges. "If you fix this right now, I will tell the lawyers to back off. I will give you a fair settlement. I will let you walk away clean with a generous check. Just fix the network before the buyers leave the building." "The buyers have already left the building," Sarah, I stated. "You and I both know they walked out the second the screens went dark. Billionaires do not wait around for a supposed CEO who cannot even control her own routing system. But let us talk about your legal threats. You cannot arrest a landlord for locking the doors to his own building when the tenant refuses to pay rent." "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her frustration boiling over into pure confusion. "I own Sentinel Logistics. I own the software. You built it for my company." "No, I built it for my wife," I corrected her. "But she does not exist anymore. I built the code, but I never gave it to Sentinel Logistics. I copyrighted the entire routing algorithm under a private limited liability company before we even got married. Thomas Whitaker Holdings owns the patents. Thomas Whitaker Holdings owns the source code. Sentinel Logistics only ever had a revocable trial license. A license I granted you out of love. A license you violated the moment you tried to sell my intellectual property to a third party without my explicit written consent." The silence that followed was absolute. I could practically hear the gears grinding to a violent halt in her head as the terrifying reality of her situation began to fully materialize. She was not a technical expert, but she understood business structure perfectly. She understood what a private holding company meant. She understood what a revoked license meant. "That is a lie," she whispered. Her voice was trembling now. The screaming rage had instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping terror. "You are lying. We checked the corporate assets. We own the servers. You own the plastic and the metal," I replied calmly. "You own the empty boxes sitting in the server room, but you do not own the ghost in the machine. You do not own the algorithm that makes those boxes valuable. If you try to bypass my lock, if you try to force the system back online without my authorization, you will be committing federal intellectual property theft. And my attorney, who is sitting right across from me listening to this entire conversation, will file an injunction that will freeze every single asset Sentinel Logistics possesses by the end of the business day." A sudden chaotic noise erupted in the background of the call. I could hear Bradley shouting something in a panicked voice, screaming at a junior technician that the entire fleet of delivery trucks was completely paralyzed on the interstate. The logistics network was collapsing by the minute. I could hear Barbara crying in the distance, her voice trembling as she asked Sarah what the billionaire buyers had meant by fraud. The perfect, arrogant facade of her wealthy family was completely disintegrating in real time. They were finally realizing that the $50 million empire they had tried to steal was built entirely on digital land they did not own. "Tom, please," Sarah said. It was the first time in over 2 years that I had heard her use the word please. The commanding chief executive officer was entirely gone. She sounded small, desperate, and completely cornered. "We can fix this. We are a team. Remember the garage. Remember all those late nights we spent building this dream together. You cannot just destroy everything we worked for over a misunderstanding. Do not do this to me. Do not do this to our family." I felt a brief hollow ache in my chest, a phantom pain for a marriage that had died a long time ago. She was trying to use our history as a weapon, trying to manipulate the love I used to have for her. But the ice in my veins held firm. The man who would have sacrificed himself to save her was frozen to death in a diner parking lot last night. "You made your choice, Sarah. You orchestrated an ambush with your mother and your brother. You stood on that stage last night and thanked everyone but me. You let your mother call me a useless parasite. You let your brother throw my life into the trash while claiming a fake executive title. You told me I was just a guy sitting at a computer. Well, this is what happens when the guy at the computer decides to log out." "What do you want?" she begged, her voice breaking into an actual sob. "Tell me what you want. I will give you anything. Just turn the system back on. I want you to call your aggressive divorce lawyers." I said, my tone absolute and final. "I want you to tell them to read the intellectual property filings my attorney is sending over right now. And then I want you to sit in that glass boardroom and watch your $50 million empire turn to dust. Have a great life, Sarah." I reached forward and ended the call. The office fell completely silent again, save for the gentle drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard took off his silver reading glasses and let out a low, impressed whistle. He looked at me not just as a client, but as a man who had just executed a flawless, devastating checkmate. The shift in power was complete. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect, and I had just demolished the building. It had been exactly 4 days since the digital guillotine dropped on Sentinel Logistics. I was sitting at a small Formica table in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. My intellectual property attorney Richard had secured a substantial legal advance against the inevitable settlement of my patents. That advance allowed me to rent a clean, quiet space far away from the sprawling mansions and exclusive country clubs of Westport. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and cheap coffee, but to my lungs it smelled like absolute freedom. I was wearing a plain gray sweater and worn jeans, watching the morning news on a small television I had purchased from a local discount store. The financial networks were already buzzing with frantic rumors about a massive, unexpected collapse of a major tech acquisition, citing catastrophic software failures and pending federal fraud investigations. The empire they had stolen from me was actively burning to the ground on live television, and I was simply drinking my coffee watching the smoke rise. A sudden, frantic knocking at my front door shattered the morning quiet. The sound was sharp and desperate, echoing loudly in the small living space. I did not move immediately. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the warm ceramic mug resting solidly in my hands. The man I used to be, the compliant, eager husband who always rushed to fix every problem, would have jumped out of his chair. But that man was dead. I set the mug down, walked across the cheap linoleum floor, and slowly opened the heavy wooden door. I did not find a delivery driver or a confused neighbor standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway of my apartment building. I found the two women who had confidently thrown me onto the freezing street just 1 week ago. Sarah and Barbara were standing there, and the physical transformation was absolutely staggering. Sarah was not wearing a tailored white designer suit. She was not wearing her expensive diamond earrings. She wore a wrinkled beige trench coat, her hair pulled back into a messy, uneven knot that looked hastily tied. The confident, visionary chief executive officer who had stood on a brightly lit stage accepting industry awards was completely gone. In her place stood a pale, exhausted, terrified woman who looked like she had not slept a single hour in 4 days. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands were shoved deep into her pockets, trembling visibly. But Barbara was the true revelation. The arrogant, wealthy matriarch who had sat on my expensive Persian rug, sipping my premium scotch and calling me a worthless parasite, looked utterly defeated. The heavy gold jewelry she usually flaunted was missing. She was physically shaking, clutching a damp, crumpled tissue in her hands. Her shoulders, which she always held so high with unearned superiority, were slumped deeply under the invisible, crushing weight of impending financial ruin. "Thomas," Barbara whispered. Her voice was weak, trembling with manufactured sorrow. Please let us come inside." I did not step aside. I did not open the door any wider. I simply stood in the doorway, blocking their path, my expression completely blank. I looked at the two of them, taking in the absolute desperation rolling off their bodies in waves. They had tracked me down to this modest building because they had nowhere else left to go. The billionaire buyers had walked away. The federal authorities were circling their bank accounts. The massive colonial house they had tried to steal from me was already facing foreclosure because they had foolishly leveraged it to the absolute limit. They were drowning, and they had come crawling back to the only man who knew how to build a lifeboat. "We need to talk to you, Tom," Sarah said. Her voice cracked, lacking any of the sharp, commanding authority she had weaponized during our marriage. "The lawyers will not even return my phone calls anymore. The company servers are completely locked. The delivery fleet has been grounded for days. We are losing millions of dollars every single hour. Please, you have to stop this. You proved your point. You won. Now please just help us fix this before we lose everything." I looked directly into Sarah's bloodshot eyes. "You already lost everything, Sarah," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "You lost it the moment you decided to steal my life's work and throw my desk into a dumpster. I am not fixing anything. The trial license has been permanently revoked." Barbara let out a loud, dramatic sob. She reached out with a trembling hand, trying to grab my forearm, but I took a slow step back, keeping my distance. She pulled her hand back and pressed the damp tissue to her face. "Thomas, you cannot do this to us," Barbara cried, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "We are a family. You and Sarah took sacred vows in front of God. You promised to love and protect each other in good times and in bad. You cannot just abandon your family when we are in trouble. It is not Christian. It is not right. We made a mistake, Thomas. We were stressed and we made a terrible mistake. But you are a good man. You have a kind, forgiving heart. Please, for the love of God, show some mercy, show some Christian forgiveness." I stood there in the doorway listening to the sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of her words. She was invoking God, mercy, and family vows. This was the exact same woman who had looked at me with unfiltered disgust and told her daughter to divorce me. This was the woman who had celebrated my eviction, who had laughed while I was forced to sleep in a freezing car in a diner parking lot with exactly $43 in my pocket. She did not care about Christian forgiveness. She did not care about family bonds. She only cared about her country club memberships, her luxury vehicles, and her social status. And now that those things were being stripped away, she was desperately trying to play the role of the fragile, remorseful mother. My brother is going to go to jail. Tom. Sarah pleaded, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her pale cheeks. Bradley tried to access the corporate funds to pay off a margin call, but the accounts were frozen by the federal investigators. He is terrified. We are all terrified. We have no money left. The house is going to be taken by the bank next week. You cannot just stand there and watch us be destroyed. We are begging you. Please, just sign the software back over to the company so we can finalize the buyout. We will give you half the money. We will give you whatever you want. I looked at Sarah, the woman I had loved and sacrificed my entire career for. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of affection, any small spark of sympathy for her tears. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. Her betrayal had been so thorough, so deeply malicious, that it had permanently severed whatever connection we once shared. She was offering me half the money for a company that I entirely owned. She was still trying to negotiate from a position of power that no longer existed. I shifted my gaze away from Sarah and locked my eyes directly onto Barbara. The older woman stopped crying for a second, looking up at me with wide, desperate, hopeful eyes. She thought she had reached me. She thought her manipulative tears and her desperate appeals to my decent nature had successfully broken through my defenses. She waited for me to sigh, to nod my head, to step aside and invite them into my warm apartment to fix their broken lives. Instead, I stood perfectly still. The silence in the hallway stretched out, growing heavier and heavier until it became almost suffocating. I let them sit in that terrible silence, letting them feel the absolute crushing weight of their own actions. I looked Barbara dead in the eye, my face a mask of cold, devastating finality. I am just a useless son-in-law, Barbara, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute force of a physical blow. You never needed me. Barbara gasped, her breath catching violently in her throat as her own cruel words were reflected directly back into her face. The fake, hopeful expression completely shattered, replaced by sheer, unfiltered horror. She realized in that exact moment that there was no negotiation. There was no mercy. There was no hidden reserve of love she could manipulate. I was simply returning the exact reality they had eagerly created for me. Sarah let out a sharp cry of panic and stepped forward, reaching her hand out toward the doorframe. Tom, wait, no, please listen to me. I did not listen. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults or tell them how much I hated them. I simply took a step backward into my modest, quiet apartment, grasped the heavy brass handle of the wooden door, and pulled it firmly shut, right in their faces. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking into place sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I stood in my entryway for a long time, listening to the muffled, chaotic sounds coming from the other side of the wood. I could hear Barbara openly weeping, her loud sobs echoing down the empty hallway. I could hear Sarah pounding her fists against the door, begging, pleading, promising me the world if I would just open the lock and save them from the nightmare they had built for themselves. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a rush of angry triumph. I only felt a profound, settling peace. The storm that had wrecked my life was finally over. The toxic infection that had poisoned my days for years had been completely cut out. Let them cry in the hallway. Let them beg the wooden door for a mercy they had actively refused to give me when I had nothing. I turned away from the door, walked back to my small formica table, and sat down in my chair. I picked up my ceramic mug, took another sip of my warm coffee, and turned my attention back to the television screen. Tomorrow I would meet with my intellectual property lawyers to finalize the direct sale of my patents to the highest bidder. I was going to be a very wealthy man, and I was going to build a new life entirely on my own terms. The pounding on the door eventually slowed, weakened, and then finally stopped altogether. I heard the slow, shuffling footsteps of two completely defeated women walking away down the long corridor, heading back out into the cold reality of the world they had made. They were gone. And for the first time in 12 years, I was truly, completely home. Completely. Family court was a completely different battlefield than the corporate boardroom. It was a place where lies were usually traded like currency, and whoever told the most convincing story walked away with the spoils. The courtroom in downtown Hartford smelled of old wood floor polish and decades of bitter resentment. I sat at the plaintiff table next to Richard Sterling, wearing a new bespoke navy suit paid for by my legal advance. Across the aisle sat Sarah and her aggressive legal team. She had dressed specifically for the occasion, wearing a modest, muted gray dress designed to make her look like the overwhelmed victim of a cruel husband. Her lead attorney was a famous shark named Patricia Voss, a woman who had built her entire career on completely destroying men in divorce settlements. Patricia aggressively organized massive stacks of fabricated financial records, trying to project an aura of absolute intimidation. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and Judge Harper took her seat. She was a stern, uncompromising woman with iron gray hair and a reputation for possessing absolutely zero patience for legal theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened the thick file containing Sarah's ridiculous petition, and looked down at the two tables. Patricia Voss immediately stood up, launching into a highly rehearsed, deeply theatrical opening statement. She painted a picture of absolute tragedy. She described Sarah as a brilliant self-made visionary who had spent 12 years building Sentinel Logistics from the ground up, only to be held hostage by a bitter, disgruntled former husband. Patricia confidently claimed that I was an unpaid hobbyist who had simply tinkered with some basic coding, and that my recent actions to lock the servers were a malicious, vindictive act of corporate cyber terrorism. She demanded my absolute surrender. Patricia formally requested that the judge make the ex parte asset freeze permanent grant Sarah full and unquestioned ownership of the $50 million company and order me to accept a pathetic $2,000 monthly stipend. She was practically begging the judge to leave me completely destitute. Sarah sat next to her lawyer, keeping her eyes cast downward in a perfect display of manufactured sorrow. She even managed to produce a single, trembling tear that caught the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. When Patricia finally finished her dramatic speech and sat down with a smug, victorious smile, Judge Harper turned her piercing gaze toward our side of the room. She asked Richard if we had a response to the petitioner's massive list of demands. Richard did not rush. He stood up slowly, completely unbothered by the heavy tension in the room. He simply picked up a single, thin manila folder from our table and walked calmly toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor, my client does not wish to contest the division of marital assets," Richard said, his voice smooth and echoing clearly in the quiet room. "We are perfectly willing to let the petitioner keep the furniture, the luxury cars, and the remaining balances in the joint checking accounts. However, we must respectfully request that the court dismiss the demands regarding Sentinel Logistics, as the petitioner is attempting to divide an asset she does not legally own. We have the proof right here." Patricia Voss actually laughed out loud, a sharp, condescending sound. She stood up aggressively, ready to voice an objection, but Judge Harper silenced her with a single sharp raise of her hand. The judge opened the manila folder Richard had handed her. Inside were the original notarized copyright filings from over a decade ago, along with the sealed, legally binding operating agreement for my private company, Thomas Whitaker Holdings. Richard explained the brutal, undeniable reality of the situation with surgical precision. I had written the core routing algorithm and filed the intellectual property under a private limited liability company, 3 full years before Sarah and I were ever legally married. The software was definitively and indisputably a premarital asset. It belonged entirely and exclusively to me. Sentinel Logistics had never purchased the software. They had never secured a transfer of the intellectual property. I had merely granted my wife's company a revocable commercial license, essentially a free trial that I had maintained out of marital goodwill. Because Sarah had actively attempted to sell my intellectual property to a third party without my explicit written consent, she had severely breached the terms of that license. Therefore, the license had been legally and permanently terminated. The entire foundation of her legal argument completely collapsed instantly. The color completely drained from Patricia Voss's face as the reality set in. The aggressive, confident shark suddenly looked like she had just been hit by a freight train. She snatched a copy of the filings from Richard's hand and frantically scanned the pages, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the ironclad legal language. She leaned down and aggressively whispered something into Sarah's ear. Sarah looked up at me, her mask of sorrow completely evaporating, replaced by sheer naked panic. She realized she was completely trapped by her lies. She had lied to her own lawyers, assuming my paperwork was just some meaningless technicality. Judge Harper did not look amused. She looked furiously indignant. She slammed her wooden gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot in the sterile courtroom. She glared directly at Sarah and her legal team, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She stated that the court had absolutely no jurisdiction to force a private holding company to hand over its premarital property. With a few swift, angry strokes of her pen, Judge Harper completely threw out Sarah's entire petition. She immediately dissolved the ex parte asset freeze, restoring my full access to all my personal capital. Furthermore, she issued a severe direct warning to Sarah, stating that if she ever attempted to weaponize the family court system to commit corporate fraud again, she would be facing immediate federal perjury charges. The courtroom checkmate was absolute, flawless, and devastating. I walked out of the downtown courthouse that afternoon and never looked back. I did not stop to gloat or wait around to watch Sarah collapse into tears. I simply got into a private car with Richard and drove directly to a secure corporate meeting room across town. Waiting for us were the exact same Silicon Valley billionaires who had walked out of Sarah's glass boardroom just a few short days prior. They were not interested in dramatic speeches or fake corporate culture. They were exclusively interested in the flawless dynamic weather prediction matrix that could save their global supply chain billions of dollars in fuel costs over the next decade, and this time they were negotiating with the actual architect. The meeting lasted exactly 45 minutes. There was no haggling, no posturing, and no arrogance. I completely bypassed Sarah Sentinel Logistics and all of her useless corporate executives. I sold the exclusive rights to the routing algorithm and the entirety of Thomas Whitaker Holdings directly to the tech conglomerate. The final purchase price was a staggering $40 million transferred immediately and securely into a newly established private trust controlled exclusively by me. I signed my name on the heavy contract, set the expensive pen down, and felt a massive invisible weight completely lift off my shoulders, while my bank accounts were overflowing with completely clean, undisputed capital. Sentinel Logistics was experiencing a rapid, catastrophic death. Without my routing algorithm, the $50 million company was instantly reduced to an empty, worthless shell. The delivery trucks were completely blind on the highways, unable to dynamically navigate storms or optimize their fuel routes. Massive, lucrative contracts were breached within days. Furious clients severed their ties and immediately fled to more stable competitors. The corporate bank accounts were rapidly drained by aggressive penalty fees and desperate attempts to manually route freight. Within 2 short weeks, Sarah was forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A few days after that, when the creditors realized there was absolutely no proprietary technology left to salvage, the filing was brutally converted to a Chapter 7 total liquidation. The massive empire she claimed she built completely vaporized into thin air overnight. But the absolute poetry of their destruction did not stop at the corporate level. Sarah and her mother Barbara had always projected the illusion of endless, unshakable wealth. But it was a hollow facade built on massive amounts of debt. Behind my back, they had secretly leveraged their $2.5 million colonial mansion, taking out a massive second mortgage to fund Bradley's aggressive cryptocurrency investments on margin. When the crypto market suddenly crashed, the brokers issued a massive margin call. Normally, they would have siphoned the funds from Sentinel Logistics to cover it. But the company was bankrupt. They had absolutely no cash, and the aggressive brokers immediately seized the remaining assets. The bank violently foreclosed on the mansion, changing the locks and repossessing their luxury vehicles. They had thrown me out into the freezing rain, but reality had just permanently evicted them from their stolen kingdom. The morning air in Colorado carries a distinct kind of silence. It is not the heavy, suffocating silence of a corporate boardroom. It is certainly not the tense, freezing silence of a diner parking lot at midnight. It is the deep, breathing silence of absolute freedom. I am sitting on the wrap-around wooden porch of a ranch I bought entirely in cash just 3 weeks ago. The property stretches out for hundreds of acres, surrounded by towering pine trees and the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. I hold a thick ceramic mug of black coffee in both my hands. I let the rising steam warm my face as the sun slowly breaks over the horizon. There are no neighbors here. There are no exclusive country clubs filled with arrogant venture capitalists. There are no mothers-in-law sipping expensive scotch and dictating the value of a man based on the label sewn into his suit. There is only the land, the quiet wind, and the absolute certainty that everything I see belongs unconditionally to me. I take a slow sip of the coffee. It tastes better than any expensive espresso I ever drank in Connecticut. Every breath of the crisp mountain air feels like a physical cleansing. It washes away the lingering smell of the old floor wax from the courthouse and the stale vanilla from that hotel lobby where my credit cards were declined. It is strange how quickly a life can completely transform when you finally decide to stop apologizing for your own brilliance. Just a few short months ago, I was a ghost. I was haunting the basement of a $50 million empire I had built with my own 2 hands. I was forced to sleep in a 10-year-old sedan with a broken heater shivering under a cheap fleece blanket while the people I trusted celebrated my destruction. Now I am sitting in the warmth of a mountain morning watching wild deer graze near the tree line of my own private estate. I look out at the vast expanse of the valley and think about the 12 years I spent trapped in a freezing garage. I had convinced myself that stepping into the shadows was the ultimate act of love. I thought that by giving Sarah the spotlight, the chief executive title, and the glory, I was being a supportive husband. I believed that a strong marriage meant elevating your partner at any personal cost. I think about my late father and the faded photograph I kept locked inside that steel vault for a decade. He was a quiet blue-collar man who understood the fundamental mechanics of building a life. He warned me never to hand over the keys to the house I built. For a long time, I thought I was proving him wrong. I thought my marriage was a modern partnership built on mutual sacrifice. But the cold reality is that my father understood the brutal nature of greed far better than I did. Love that requires you to permanently shrink yourself is not love at all. It is just exploitation dressed up as partnership. Sarah did not love me. She loved the utility I provided. She loved the flawless code I generated. She loved the massive wealth that flowed from my exhausted fingers. When she stood on that brightly lit stage and thanked everyone except the man who built her foundation, she revealed the absolute emptiness of her character. She had consumed my youth, my ambition, and my intellect, and then she tried to discard the empty wrapper. And then there was her toxic family, Barbara and Bradley. They were the architects of their own destruction. They were driven by a blinding entitlement that I can now only look back on with profound, quiet pity. They worshipped the hollow illusion of wealth. They believed that true power came from shouting the loudest in a glass boardroom or holding the deed to a $2.5 million colonial mansion they could not actually afford. People who produce absolutely nothing of value are almost always the loudest voices in the room. They spent years mocking the quiet man who simply sat at a computer. They were completely unaware that the quiet man was actively holding the entire gravitational field of their universe together. They mistook my quiet patience for weakness. They mistook my silence for ignorance. When they handed me that packed canvas duffel bag and threw me out into the freezing rain, they genuinely believed they were discarding a broken machine. They never realized they were actually unplugging their own life support. I read the financial news articles about their total collapse with a strange sense of detachment. Bradley is currently facing massive civil lawsuits from furious investors who realized he possesses absolutely no operational skills. His fake title as vice president became a hilarious joke across the entire logistics industry. Barbara was forced to pack her expensive designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes when the bank locked the doors to her foreclosed mansion. The irony is absolutely perfect. They spent their entire lives judging people based on the size of their bank accounts, and now they are completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to them. They wonder if it felt good to exact such a brutal, calculated revenge. But the truth is, I never sought revenge. Revenge requires anger, and anger requires you to still care about the people who hurt you. By the time I sat down in that public library and clicked the mouse to terminate their software license, I was completely empty of any malice. I simply allowed the truth to reassert itself. I stopped carrying their dead weight and let the natural laws of physics take over. When you build a massive glittering tower on digital land, you do not actually own. You cannot blame the landlord when the building eventually collapses. Sentinel Logistics went bankrupt because it was an empty shell hiding behind a stolen algorithm. The bank foreclosed on their mansion because they were drowning in greedy margin calls and terrible cryptocurrency investments. I did not need to scream at them in a crowded hallway. I did not need to hire expensive lawyers to argue my worth in front of a tired judge. I just handed them the absolute reality of their own incompetence, and they crushed themselves under the heavy weight of it. The universe has a very strict accounting system. You can manipulate the numbers for a few years, but eventually the ledger always balances itself. They tried to erase my 12 years of sacrifice, and the resulting mathematical correction wiped them completely off the map. The $40 million sitting securely in my private trust does not define me. It is simply the undeniable legal receipt for the immense value I brought into the world. It bought this beautiful ranch, yes, but more importantly, it bought my total autonomy. I wake up every single morning and I breathe clean air. I have started writing new code not for a demanding corporate board, but simply because I love the elegant logic of solving complex puzzles. I am no longer a forgotten footnote in someone else's fabricated success story. I am the sole author of my own reality. I look back at the man shivering in that dark diner parking lot counting his last $43, and I feel a deep abiding respect for him. He endured the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. He absorbed the deepest humiliations a toxic family could inflict, and he did not break. He analyzed the corrupt system, he found the structural flaw, and he quietly rewrote the ending to his own story. The sun is fully above the majestic mountains now, painting the wide Colorado sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep orange. I take one last long sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid settle deeply in my chest. I have learned the hardest and most valuable lesson a man can ever learn about human nature. Love requires trust, but building a legacy requires boundaries. Never let anyone convince you that the quiet architect is weaker than the loud salesman. We all have a choice when we are pushed into a corner by people who refuse to see our true value. You can either surrender and accept the narrative they have written for you, or you can retrieve the master keys and shut their entire system down. If you have ever had your hard work taken for granted by toxic in-laws, hit that like button. Share your story in the comments below about a time you had to take your power back, and make sure to subscribe for more stories of truth coming to light.